Everyone get out!
Hello tankers and tankettes, it's test server time, it's the 8.10 test server, and I thought I would have a quick look, and it's going to be very much an overview video. I'm going to do an overview of the Japanese tanks. I've basically been hunched over a spreadsheet all morning typing in the numbers, and it's shown some interesting things actually. But if you want a more in-depth look at the individual tanks, Circon has done a video. High Flyer has done a video. I'm sure QB's working on something. So there will be more in-depth looks at the individual vehicles around. But I just wanted to give a kind of an overview, a look at what the numbers reveal, and they do reveal some interesting things. There are also some other interesting things in the patch which I will touch on. We've got not just the Japanese tree, but we've also got two new Soviet mediums. There's a couple of new tanks that are going to be available in game now. The Chinukai and the Type 64 are both going to be available in the in-game shop. There's a new map, Hidden Village, which is going to be Japanese themed, of course, because there's Japanese tanks. There's some of the tanks have actually been reworked. There are changes to how penetration works as regards some destructible objects, and this has been quite an important change. Things like fences are now no longer going to be destroyed by your shells. What will happen is your shell will pass through, it'll destroy the object, but it will lose 25 mil of penetration in the process. So if you're shooting through 4 fences in a row, you're going to lose 100 mil. But it means that no longer is hiding behind a brick wall going to save you from taking one shot. It means someone will be able to fire through that brick wall and they'll still be able to damage your tank quite probably. This is going to have big implications for some maps, like for instance the northwest even corner of Port, where there's those lines of brick walls and people, they'll use them to hide behind their tank because they know someone will have to take a shot and the shot will get eaten by the wall. That's not going to be the case any longer. That shot's going to go through, so it's going to mean you're going to have to be more cautious. But also, having said that, for some of these objects the spotting system is the same. So if you're behind a wall and fences can be seen through, but walls like that can't be seen through, is my understanding. So you're still going to have some protection from people spotting you. You're just not going to have protection from that first shell any longer. There's also going to be various other smaller changes. There's some, well, you'll just notice in the garage the lighting has been reworked a bit. This is I honestly thought a lot of this was going to go into the 9 the 0.9 patch, but obviously what they've done is they've put some of the changes in this patch, and then the 0.9 patch is going to be all about the havoc physics and things flying off tanks, and we've seen some previews of that already. There's also been, as with all patches, there's been some balancing on various tanks and model changes. There's this kind of thing goes on in every patch, and none of it's massively important. But I'll put a link in the description below to the full patch notes. But personally, I think the most interesting things are, obviously, aside from the Japanese tanks, I think it's the graphical changes. And when I do some gameplay later on, I will obviously get to, well, we'll all get to see that firsthand. But first and foremost, I wanted to actually give the headlines first and do a quick look at the Japanese tanks, which, without further ado, I think we should get on to. So here we go. You might have noticed a bit of a jump there, but I actually decided to record this video in 2 parts just because it was easier to do so. The first part I actually recorded whilst I was waiting in the queue. I did have a look in the client this morning, didn't record anything then, but having come back to it, there is actually now a queue to get on the test server, which is kind of fairly typical. So what are we actually getting with the Japanese? Well, it's 4 light tanks and a whole bunch of mediums, and it basically is pretty much a medium line. Some of the low tier mediums, there's not that much difference between them and the lights, but I'm not going to look at individual vehicles too much. I will just point out the Churha, which we actually already have in game as a light tank for the the Chinese, but it's classified as a medium here, and that's how the Japanese themselves classified it, even though in reality it is closer to a light tank. So, what do we actually get with all of these vehicles? Well, the headlines are kind of interesting. Like I said, I've been plugging all the numbers into a spreadsheet. Not all of the numbers, but the ones that I think are the most interesting. Basically, what we're looking at is okay. Bear in mind these are all mediums and lights, but even for mediums and lights, they're pretty poor armored machines. You're not going to be able to rely on your armor for any of these. And at the low tiers, they're all actually physically quite small machines. Even the light tanks especially. I mean, these are all barely bigger than the tier 1, which is a Renault FT, or rather it's the kind of the immediate successor to the Renault FT, which was sold to quite a few countries. We start to get large tanks at kind of tier 4, tier 5. I think tier 7 is by far the biggest machine. I mean, that thing's pretty huge. And then they start to shrink a bit. They get a bit more low profile for the tier 8, 9 and 10. And the tier 10 especially is very low profile, which you're going to need. The tier 10 is also the only one that really has any armor that's kind of worth anything. And the hull is it's got a pretty good frontal slope, but what's most interesting is this turret. It's only 132, but it's 132 front and sides. And look at the profile on that and the sloping on that. That's pretty nice. That's going to be quite bouncy. It does, of course, have a commander's hatch, which is almost certainly going to be a weak spot. I haven't got an armor scheme to hand for this, but it's going to be a damn interesting vehicle, that's for sure. Some of the other things that they all have in common, the view ranges are kind of average to good, which they're nothing to complain about. The STV one actually has 410, which is I think the best view range you can get in game without modifying it with equipment. The radios are very interesting. In fact, you get good radios early on. The Otsu has 350, which is for a tier 1 that's pretty good. And then we kind of jump to 400, and then you get to tier 3 and it goes to 550. That's really good for tier 3. That holds true until I think, yeah, that's 550 on tier 5. And then you immediately, there's a big jump from tier 5 to tier 6. You get the 750 radio, and that's true all the way up to the top tier. So they've all characterized by having very good radio range, which is, it's not a thing people get excited about on tanks especially, but it's a useful characteristic even. Yeah. The other big feature is their mobility, and they all have, again, good, average to good to, in some cases, really good horsepower per ton ratios. There's quite a jump at tier 5. Tier 6 is, look at the difference, 18 tons, and then it's a jump to over 32 tons, and that's quite a heavy tank. This thing's over 40 tons. This is just a big machine anyway. You're going to have a hard time hiding that. And then they start to shrink in size a bit, and 37 tons is not bad for a medium. And by that point, you've got a fairly meaty engine as well. So this is actually not got the best horsepower per ton ratio of all of them. The best horsepower per ton ratio is actually on the tier 3 light tank, which I will just show you. This thing is going to be properly whizzy at tier 3. It's 50 mile an hour, 50 kilometer an hour speed limit. 150 horsepower doesn't sound like much, but 7.35. So this is about the weight of an ELC pretty much, and it's obviously less nippy. It's going to be much less nippy than an ELC, but for tier 3 this thing's going to be seriously fast. This is quite a nice machine indeed. It's not as good as the Cruiser 4 I'm thinking specifically of, which has got I think 25 horsepower per ton, but still this is quite a nice machine, and it's very low profile. I mean, it's actually slightly shorter than the tier 1, so that thing's going to be interesting. But the tier 10 is only just behind it. I mean, that the tier 3 is 20.41, the tier 10 is going to be 20.05, and that's quite nice. The rest are all of the mediums. The lowest is actually the tier 6, which gets 12.23 with the top engine. The rest are all kind of 13, 14, 15, and then for tier 8 and 9 it's 16.73 and 17.26 respectively, which is pretty decent for a medium tank. And you're going to need it because the lack of armor means you're going to absolutely need that mobility. The other thing that they all seem to have is very good hull traverse, and the absolute worst of any of them is actually the Otsu, which has got 36 degrees per second, which is, again, it's good for a tier 1. The very best is the Type 5 tier 4 light, which has got 60 degrees traverse speed. The tier 10's not too far behind that. That has 52 degrees per second, and the rest are all kind of in the 30s and 40s, so they're all pretty good. Some of them are in the actually, no, I don't think there was any in the 50s. I was going to say somewhere in the 50s, but the STB is the only one that's in the 50s. But for the most part, they're all in the 30s and 40s with the in terms of hull traverse. Actually, I've just spotted it. I was wrong. It's actually the Type 97, the tier 3 medium, that has the worst. So that's 32 degrees, but still 32 degrees is good. This is light tank good, and these are all medium tanks. So even the tier 7, this hulking great thing, gets a 34 degree traverse speed, and that's not to be complained about. But I think by far the most interesting thing, and this is the big headline, by far the most interesting thing I have spotted by putting all these numbers into spreadsheets is that these tanks all have very, very good DPM. Some of them actually have best in class / tier DPM. They are the best in their class for their tier in terms of their damage per minute. Now, it's not always on the top gun. Some of them actually have the best DPM with the stock guns. I think the most interesting example is probably this thing, the tier 9, which gets the tier 10 gun, but it also gets the top gun of the STA-1 as its stock gun. The stock gun has better DPM than the top gun, even though you might actually want the top gun for the actual pop out and do them some damage factor. But the DPM with the 90mm gun is 2,880, which is that's pretty damn good. That's better than some of the tier 10s. But bear in mind you're working with 218 pen. But some people might prefer the extra DPM. Just I don't know. Some people are like that. They'll take the DPM gun over the alpha gun. The STB1 gets by far and away the best in its class. It's 2900, 2000 numbers. Curse you, numbers! Curse you! 2,925. There we go. I got it out in the end, which is really very good. But that is kind of reflected across all of them. Even some of the light tanks have got the best DPM for their class. The tier 4 has got 1875 DPM with this 75mm experimental. That is crazy. That's a tier 4 tank with nearly 1900 DPM. That is just frankly nuts. But some of them are not quite that nuts, but some of them are still fairly nuts. The tier 5, which is familiar to most people, or the shape of it's familiar to most people because it's basically the same hull as the Chinukai. It with again that 57mm experimental tank gun that has 1957 DPM. That is again nearly 2000 DPM. At tier 5, that's kind of crazy. But this is probably one where people are going to want to use the top gun, the 75mm, just because the pen is actually better than a KV1. The average damage is not quite as good as the KV1, but that's still pretty good. 125. That's a very nice gun. So that's one where I think people will, even if the DPM of the stock gun is better, they're probably going to go with the gun with the best alpha and the best pen. So yeah, those are kind of really the headlines. It's the mobility and it's the DPM, and the radios are kind of a secondary thing, but it's still fairly nice. So I think they're going to be fairly interesting as a class to play. And if you like medium tanks, I think you're really going to like the Japanese medium tanks, because they offer lots of mobility, which is important in a medium, and they also offer the ability to dish out lots of damage as well, potentially. Bear in mind the DPM number is always going to be, ideal conditions, and you're not going to often get that. But some of these tanks I think are going to be very interesting indeed. So I will add one last caveat and say this is of course the first test server. Some of this is going to change, but I think as a whole, the kind of the look and feel of the Japanese tanks, Wargaming have obviously decided this is what they wanted Japanese mediums and even the lights to be like, to have mobility and high DPM, and I don't think that's going to massively change even if some of the numbers get tweaked. So hopefully you found this interesting. I'm going to take an actual look at some of the gameplay later, as I've said, but for now I just wanted to get this video out, which gives all the kind of an overview of the Japanese tanks and also of some of the other stuff that's coming in the patch. So if you like this video, you can hit the like button, you can leave a comment, you can subscribe to my channel, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.